Welcome back, to all you who've been following my channel. I'm so happy to have you all that come here, to be listening to my various stories. I am just learning how to adjust the microphone settings. So please have some patience with some of my mistakes along the way in this process. Hitting that like and subscribe button is free, since I am a small channel. I am hoping to grow with all of you along this journey. So let us start with our next story of mystery and mayhem. In debt, and Klopfer suspected that he had stolen almost everything of significant value that he possessed. When she confronted him over a new TV and stereo, he warned her, "If you tell anyone, I'll break your fucking neck." She said Bundy became very upset whenever she considered cutting her hair, which was long and parted in the middle. She would sometimes awaken in the middle of the night to find him under the bed covers with a flashlight, examining her body. He kept a lug wrench, taped halfway up the handle, in the trunk of her car, another Volkswagen Beetle, which he often borrowed, for protection. The detectives confirmed that Bundy had not been with Klopfer on any of the nights during which the Pacific Northwest victims had vanished. Nor on the day Ott and Naslund were abducted from Lake Sammamish State Park. Shortly thereafter, Klopfer was interviewed by Seattle homicide detective Kathy McChesney and learned of the existence of Diane Edwards and her brief engagement to Bundy around Christmas 1973. In September, Bundy sold his Volkswagen Beetle to a Midvale teenager. Utah police impounded it, and FBI technicians dismantled and searched it. They found hairs matching samples obtained from Campbell's body. Later, they also identified hair strands, microscopically indistinguishable, from those of Smith and Duranch. FBI lab specialist Robert Neal concluded that the presence of hair strands in one car matching three different victims who had never met one another would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. On October 2nd, detectives put Bundy into a lineup. Duranch immediately identified him as Officer Roseland, and witnesses from Bountiful recognized him as the stranger at the Viewmont High School auditorium. There was insufficient evidence to link him to Kent, whose body was never found, but more than enough evidence to charge him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the Duranch case. He was freed on $15,000 bail, paid by his parents, and spent most of the time between indictment and trial in Seattle, living in Klopfer's house. Seattle police had insufficient evidence to charge him in the Pacific Northwest murders but kept him under close surveillance. "When Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere," Klopfer wrote, "so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. In November, the three principal Bundy investigators, Jerry Thompson from Utah, Robert Keppel from Washington, and Michael Fisher from Colorado, met in Aspen, Colorado, and exchanged information with 30 detectives and prosecutors from 5 states. While officials left the meeting, later referred to as the Aspen Summit, convinced that Bundy was the murderer they sought, they agreed that more hard evidence would be needed before he could be charged with any of the murders. In February 1976, Bundy stood trial for the Duranch kidnapping. On the advice of his attorney, John O'Connell, he waived his right to a jury due to the negative publicity surrounding the case. After a 4-day bench trial and a weekend of deliberation, Judge Stuart Hansen Jr. found him guilty of kidnapping and assault. In June he was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in the Utah State Prison. In October, he was found hiding in bushes in the prison yard carrying an escape kit, road maps, airline schedules, and a social security card, and spent several weeks in solitary confinement. Later that month, Colorado authorities charged him with Campbell's murder. After a period of resistance, he waived extradition proceedings and was transferred to Aspen in January 1977. On June 7, 1977, Bundy was transported 40 miles from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs to Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. He had elected to serve as his attorney, and as such, was excused by the judge from wearing handcuffs or leg shackles. During a recess, he asked to visit the courthouse's law library to research his case. While shielded from his guard's view behind a bookcase, he opened a window and jumped to the ground from the second story, injuring his right ankle as he landed. After shedding an outer layer of clothing, Bundy limped through Aspen as roadblocks were being set up on its outskirts, then hiked south onto Aspen Mountain. Near its summit, he broke into a hunting cabin and stole food, clothing, and a rifle. The following day, he left the cabin and continued south toward the town of Crested Butte, but became lost in the forest. For 2 days he wandered on the mountain, missing 2 trails that led downward to his intended destination. On June 10th, he broke into a camping trailer on Maroon Lake, 10 miles, 16 kilometers south of Aspen, taking food and a ski parka. However, instead of continuing southward, he walked back north toward Aspen, eluding roadblocks and search parties along the way. 3 days later, he stole a car at the edge of Aspen Golf Course. Cold, sleep-deprived, and in constant pain from his sprained ankle, Bundy drove back into Aspen, where 2 police officers noticed his car weaving in and out of its lane and pulled him over. He had been a fugitive for 6 days. In the car were maps of the mountain area around Aspen that prosecutors were using to demonstrate the location of Campbell's body. As his attorney, Bundy had rights of discovery, indicating that his escape was not a spontaneous act, but had been planned. Back in jail in Glenwood Springs, Bundy ignored the advice of friends and legal advisors to stay put. The case against him, already weak at best, was deteriorating steadily as pre-trial motions consistently resolved in his favor and significant bits of evidence was ruled inadmissible. A more rational defendant might have realized that he stood a good chance of acquittal and that beating the murder charge in Colorado would probably have dissuaded other prosecutors, with as little as a year and a half to serve on the DeRanche conviction. Had Ted persevered, he could have been a free man. Instead, Bundy assembled a new escape plan. He acquired a detailed floor plan of the Garfield County Jail and a hacksaw blade from other inmates. He further accumulated $500 in cash, something he later said was smuggled in over 6 months by visitors, Boone in particular. During the evenings, while other prisoners were showering, he sawed a hole about 1 square foot, 0.093 square meters, between the steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling. Having lost 35 pounds, 16 kilograms, he was able to wriggle through and explore the crawl space above, allowing him to make a series of practice runs in the weeks that followed. Multiple reports from an informant of movement within the ceiling during the night were not investigated. By late 1977, Bundy's impending trial had become a cause célèbre in the small town of Aspen, and Bundy filed a motion for a change of venue to Denver. On December 23, the Aspen trial judge granted the request, but to Colorado Springs, where juries had historically been hostile to murder suspects. On the night of December 30th, with most of the jail staff on Christmas break and nonviolent prisoners on furlough with their families, Bundy piled books and files in his bed, covered them with a blanket to simulate his sleeping body, and climbed into the crawl space. He broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening with his wife, changed into street clothes from the jailer's closet, and walked out the front door to freedom. After stealing a car, Bundy drove eastward out of Glenwood Springs, but the car soon broke down in the mountains on Interstate 70. A passing motorist gave him a ride into Vail, 60 miles, 97 kilometers, to the east. From there he caught a bus to Denver, where he boarded a morning flight to Chicago. Back in Glenwood Springs, the jail's skeleton crew did not discover the escape until noon on December 31st, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy was already in Chicago. From Chicago, Bundy traveled by train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where he was present in a local tavern on January 2nd. 5 days later, he stole a car and drove south to Atlanta, where he boarded a bus and arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, on the morning of January 8. He stayed for one night at a hotel before he rented a room under the alias Chris Hagen at a boarding house near the Florida State University, FSU, campus. Bundy later said that he initially resolved to find legitimate employment and refrain from further criminal activity, knowing he could probably remain free and undetected in Florida indefinitely as long as he did not attract the attention of police. But his lone job application, at a construction site, had to be abandoned when he was asked to produce identification. He reverted to his old habits of shoplifting and stealing money and credit cards from women's wallets left in shopping carts at local grocery stores. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, 1 week after he arrived in Tallahassee, Bundy gained access to FSU's Chi Omega sorority house through a rear door with a faulty locking mechanism. Beginning at about 2:45 a.m. he bludgeoned Margaret Bowman, 21, with a heavy piece of oak firewood as she slept, crushing her skull. He then garroted her with a nylon stocking and ripped her underwear off with such force that friction burns were found on one of her thighs. After killing Bowman, he walked directly across the hall and entered the bedroom of 20-year-old Lisa Levy, beating her unconscious and strangling her. In what would become one of the key pieces of evidence against him at his trial, Bundy bit deeply into Levy's left buttock and through one of her nipples, nearly severing it from her right breast. Using a bottle of hair mist Levy had in her room, he raped her vaginally and anally in an assault so violent that it ruptured her internal organs. In an adjoining bedroom he attacked Kathy Kleiner of a sexual assault. The fact that Bundy attacked Thomas so soon after the murders of Bowman and Levy was something that bewildered law enforcement, with Sheriff Ken Katsaris initially expressing shock and disbelief that the same person would strike twice in such a short period. On February 8, Bundy drove 150 miles east to Jacksonville in a stolen FSU van. In a parking lot, he approached 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter, the daughter of the Jacksonville Police Department's chief of detectives, identifying himself as Richard Burton, Fire Department, but retreated when Parmenter's older brother arrived and confronted him. That afternoon, he backtracked 60 miles westward to Lake City. At Lake City Junior High School the following morning, 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was summoned to her homeroom by a teacher to retrieve a forgotten purse. She never returned to class. 7 weeks later, after an intensive search, her partially mummified remains were found in a pig farrowing shed near Sewanee River State Park, 35 miles northwest of Lake City. Forensic experts surmised that Leach had been raped before having her throat cut. On February 12, with insufficient cash to pay his overdue rent and a growing suspicion that police were closing in on him, Bundy stole a car and fled Tallahassee, driving westward across the Florida Panhandle. 3 days later, at around 1 a.m., he was stopped by Pensacola police officer David Lee near the Alabama state line after warrants check showed his Volkswagen Beetle was stolen. When told he was under arrest, Bundy kicked Lee's legs out from under him and took off running. Lee fired 2 warning shots, then gave chase and tackled him. The two struggled over Lee's gun before the officer finally subdued and arrested Bundy. In the stolen vehicle were 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television set. Also found were a pair of dark-rimmed non-prescription glasses and a pair of plaid slacks, later identified as the disguise worn by Richard Burton, Fire Department, in Jacksonville. As Lee transported his suspect to jail, unaware that he had just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he heard Bundy say, "I wish you had killed me." Following a change of venue to Miami, Bundy stood trial for the Chi Omega homicides and assaults in June 1979. The trial was covered by 250 reporters from 5 continents and was the first to be televised nationally in the United States. Despite the presence of 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy again handled much of his defense. From the beginning, he sabotaged the entire defense effort out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion, Nelson later wrote. Ted was facing murder charges, with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him was that he be in charge. According to Mike Minerva, a Tallahassee public defender and member of the defense team, a pretrial plea bargain was negotiated in which Bundy would plead guilty to killing Levy, Bowman, and Leach in exchange for a firm 75-year prison sentence. Prosecutors were amenable to a deal, by one account, because prospects of losing at trial were very good. Bundy, on the other hand, saw the plea deal not only as a means of avoiding the death penalty, but also as a tactical move. He could enter his plea, then wait a few years for evidence to disintegrate or become lost and for witnesses to die. Move on, or retract their testimony. Once the case against him had deteriorated beyond repair, he could file a post-conviction motion to set aside the plea and secure an acquittal. At the last minute, however, Bundy refused the deal. It made him realize he was going to have to stand up in front of the whole world and say he was guilty, Minerva said. He just couldn't do it. Theodore Robert Bundy, born Cowell, November 24, 1946 to January 24, 1989, was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, and murdered numerous young women and girls during the 1970s and possibly earlier. After more than a decade of denials, he confessed to 30 murders committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978. His true victim total is unknown and likely significantly higher. Bundy was often regarded as charismatic and handsome, traits he exploited to win the trust of both his victims and society as a whole. He typically approached women in public places, either asking for help by feigning a physical impairment such as an injury or impersonating an authority figure. Once tricked into being led away, they would be bludgeoned unconscious and taken elsewhere to be sexually assaulted and killed. Bundy frequently revisited the bodies of those he abducted, grooming and performing sex acts on the corpses until decomposition and destruction by wild animals made any further interactions impossible. At least 12 of his victims were decapitated and their severed heads were kept as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, he broke into homes at night and bludgeoned his victims as they slept. He did not have any remorse for any of his victims in this life and was electrocuted in 1979, where the world showed him no compassion. There were even fan clubs for this monster in which I am not sure why you would idolize a man who would kill you without any problems.